Welcome to this explainer. Let's just dive right in. Today, we're tracing one of the most remarkable and sweeping territorial expansions in all of human history, the rise of the Russian Empire. We're going to explore exactly how a relatively small regional principality centered right around Moscow transformed over the centuries into an absolute transcontinental behemoth. It's a wild story of relentless expansion, dramatic cultural shifts, and a deep underlying paradox that eventually set the stage for its dramatic fall. To truly wrap our heads around the scale of what we're talking about, we have to look at a pretty staggering number. At its absolute height in the late 19th century, this empire covered an astonishing 22.8 million square kilometers. I mean, this state spanned all the way from the freezing waters of the Arctic Ocean in the north, straight down to the Black Sea in the south, and from the Baltic Sea in the west, stretching all the way across the vast expanse of Eurasia. To put that massive number into perspective, we're talking about roughly 1/6 of the entire planet's landmass. Think about that for a second. By the late 19th century, this staggering territorial footprint made it the third largest empire in all of human history, trailing only behind the British and the Mongol empires. But here's the kicker. Unlike the overseas, far-flung colonial networks built by the British or the French, the Russian Empire was a massive, contiguous block of land, stretching unbroken across Europe and Asia. So why does all this history still matter today? Well, the borders of the Russian Empire prior to 1917 didn't just encompass the modern Russian Federation. This single state included almost all of modern Russia, plus Dnieper, Ukraine, Belarus, the Grand Duchy of Finland, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and the Central Asian states of Russian Turkestan. Heck, between 1799 and 1867, it even included Alaska, which was known back then as Russian America, and they even established settlements stretching all the way down to California and Hawaii. The geopolitical map of our world today is deeply, deeply informed by the historical footprint of this giant. But to truly grasp this sweeping, snowballing momentum, we need to rewind and watch how it all began. Chapter 1, Gathering the Russian Lands. So, back in the 15th century, the fractured Russian lands were actually dominated by a noble class known as the boyars, and ruled by a grand prince. At that point, the realm was overwhelmingly ethnic Russian and Orthodox Christian. But across the centuries, this incredible expansion was driven by a few key architects. The groundwork was laid by Ivan III, Ivan the Great. He basically secured independence from the Tatars, centralized the national state, and started using that famous double-headed eagle symbol. Then, jumping to the 16th century, his grandson, Ivan IV, became the very first Russian monarch to be crowned Tsar of all Russia, officially adopting a title that essentially claimed equality to an emperor. Moving into the 18th century, Peter the Great officially proclaimed the empire, and a bit later, Catherine the Great dramatically expanded its borders westward and southward, using a mix of diplomacy and sheer conquest, even participating in the partitions of Poland. Now, the sheer velocity of this growth was absolutely staggering. Get this, between 1550 and 1700, the Russian state was growing by an average of 35,000 square kilometers every single year. It's almost hard to fathom. A major driver of this explosive eastward push deep into Siberia was the pursuit of the highly lucrative fur trade. As the state conquered the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan and pushed relentlessly toward the Pacific, the nation was transforming from a relatively mono-ethnic realm into something much, much larger and way more complex. And that brings us to Chapter 2, Forging a European Power. You see, this relentless eastward push into Asia was eventually matched by a really dramatic cultural shift back toward the West. The empire's leaders quickly realized that to actually compete on the world stage, mere landmass just wasn't going to cut it. They needed to modernize, and fast. The chief architect of this pivot was Peter the Great. He essentially forced modernization onto his vast realm. In 1721, he officially proclaimed the Russian Empire. And then he took the incredibly bold step of moving the capital completely away from traditional Moscow. Instead, he built a glittering new, Western-oriented capital city, totally from scratch, St. Petersburg. Peter spearheaded a massive cultural revolution that replaced traditionalist systems with a modern, scientific, rationalist, and very European-oriented state system. He completely altered the social structure and fought the Great Northern War specifically to elevate Russia's standing in the world. Well, those heavy-handed reforms definitely paid off, leading us into Chapter 3, the Continental Giant. Russia rapidly emerged as the most populous state in all of Europe. But, as you might guess, with massive expansion comes incredible complexity. By the time of the 1897 census, the empire boasted a total population of 126 million people, and expanding meant absorbing highly diverse populations spanning multiple faiths. So while 71.3% were part of the officially recognized Eastern Orthodox Church, you also had 9.2% Catholic, 7.7% other Christian denominations, 7.1% practicing Islam, and 4.2% practicing Judaism. The empire even had a recognized Buddhist minority. It was a real melting pot. In fact, ethnic Russians only made up about 45% of this vast realm. So over the centuries, the empire had entirely morphed from that mono-ethnic Muscovite state of the 15th century into a highly complex, multi-ethnic tapestry containing over 100 different ethnic groups. As you can imagine, trying to manage the cultural, linguistic, and religious diversity of such a massive, unbroken landmass was just an immense bureaucratic and political headache for the Tsars. However, underneath this grand, seemingly invincible exterior lurked a really profound and dangerous vulnerability. Chapter 4: The Paradox of Power. Russia's external might stood in stark contrast to its internal fragility. Sure, they enjoyed incredible military success. I mean, think of Alexander I burning Moscow and just grinding down French forces to completely crush Napoleon's ambitions. That absolutely cemented Russia's status as a premier global power. But the grim reality was that the empire's economy lagged dangerously behind. While nations like Britain and France were just accelerating through the Industrial Revolution, Russia's shiny status as a great power was basically concealing the inefficiency of its government, the isolation of its people, and some really severe economic backwardness. The brutal root of this economic backwardness is perfectly captured by this staggering number, 23 million. That was the number of agricultural serfs in Russia. Unlike in the West, nearly the entire Russian population was devoted to agriculture, with grain yields trailing far, far behind Europe. These 23 million human beings were literally tied to the land in a feudal system that heavily restricted economic progress and social mobility. It wasn't until 1861 that Emperor Alexander II finally initiated reforms that emancipated these serfs. But here's the thing. For an empire desperately trying to compete in a rapidly industrializing world, hanging on to serfdom for that long had already kneecapped their economic progress. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. How long can a state spanning 1/6 of the globe truly survive when its economy is essentially trapped in the past? Ultimately, that failure to modernize socially and economically caught up with them. The devastating famine of 1891, growing political radicalization, the 1905 revolution, and the crushing, demoralizing defeats of World War I finally shattered this fragile titan. In 1917, the last emperor, Nicholas II, abdicated, bringing a sudden end to the Russian Empire and forever changing the course of the 20th century. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this incredible piece of history. I hope it gives you a much clearer picture of how this massive empire rose to such heights and exactly why it ultimately fell.